Hello, I'm Jim Walsh, Policy Director at Food and Water Watch, and I'm honored to kick off the launch of the CCS Action Network, an effort to build a strong nationwide resistance to the carbon capture industry. And first, I want to recognize our co-hosts who helped make this event possible. Bold Alliance, CURE, Dakota Rural Action, Eco Justice Collaborative, Food and Water Watch, Illinois Coalition to Stop CO2 Pipelines, Indigenous Environmental Network, and the Science Environmental Health Network. The CCS Action Network is working to unite communities across the country to stop dangerous CO2 pipelines, block unsafe carbon capture injection wells, and prevent billions in public subsidies from being wasted on a failed and fraudulent industry. Carbon capture is not about climate solutions. It's about corporate greed. And the technology exists to extend the life of fossil fuels, not to reduce emissions. And the industry's plan puts communities at risk across the country, be it rural and indigenous communities facing dangerous carbon dioxide pipelines, or environmental justice communities facing more pollution from dirty power plants and refineries, or working families facing higher energy bills for this expensive technology that will drive up energy prices, all while handing billions of taxpayer dollars to billionaires in the fossil fuel industry and big agricultural interests. We've already seen dangers from this industry. A CO2 pipeline rupture in Satarsha, Mississippi left people unconscious and struggling to breathe, and first responders, without proper training and equipment to handle the emergency, faced rescue vehicles not running because of lack of oxygen in the air that prevented their engines from working. And nearly an hour it took them to figure out what was actually happening to people. Multiple CO2 well failures in Illinois and Texas are threatening drinking water supplies. And now companies want to crisscross the Midwest and other regions of the country with thousands of miles of new pipelines and create more dangerous injection wells with no real plan for protecting public safety. And despite these risks, lawmakers are planning to fast-track permits while companies are actively lobbying to weaken oversight and accountability. Just yesterday, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee held a hearing pushing for carbon capture expansion, ignoring safety risks and community opposition. Last week, Senator John Barrasso introduced legislation to increase taxpayer subsidies for carbon capture when used to increase oil drilling. And meanwhile, fossil fuel-backed trade groups are pressuring Congress to protect their subsidies in a massive spending bill that's being taken up by the Budget Committee just today. And this industry is demanding billions in public money for a scam that keeps polluters in business while putting frontline communities in danger. And that's why we're here, to build power, hold lawmakers accountable, and make it clear that communities will not be sacrificed for corporate profit. We need to expose these backroom deals and fight for real solutions that put people's health and safety first. One action we're moving forward are district meetings in March. We will help people around the country meet with and educate their members of Congress and senators about the numerous concerns with carbon dioxide development in their communities. You can see a link in chat where you can actually sign up to help coordinate a meeting with your local representatives. Signing up, we'll be in touch to connect you with trainings and resources to help you have a successful meeting with your members of Congress and tell them why you and your community are concerned about carbon capture development. Together, we can make a difference and overcome these corporate lobbyists that are pushing these climate scams and reaping billions of dollars in profits. We're joined here tonight by an incredible group of leaders who are on the front lines of this fight. We'll hear from Representative Ro Khanna, who's led to charge in Congress to end carbon capture subsidies that prop up the oil drilling. As chair of the House Oversight Subcommittee on the Environment, he brought fossil fuel CEOs before Congress to testify on climate disinformation, exposing their decades-long campaign of deception. He's fought to redirect public funds away from polluters and towards policies that will strengthen our communities and protect public health. We'll hear from Pam Richart, co-director of the Eco Justice Collaborative, which has been a driving force in the fight against carbon capture pipelines in Illinois. She's played a key role in shaping the Illinois carbon capture regulations and has helped organize grassroots resistance that has already stopped two major pipeline proposals. She works closely with frontline communities to expose the risks of injection wells and failures from their oversight. We'll hear from Kim Junker, a farmer from Butler and Grundy County, Iowa, who's been on the front lines of landowner opposition to Navigator and Summit carbon pipelines. Along with her husband Ted, she's fought eminent domain abuse and corporate deception, leading local organizing efforts and standing up for rural communities threatened by this industry. She's a key member of Iowa's landowner lobby team, which has been pushing lawmakers for stronger protections for nearly 4 years. Peg Furshong is a director of director of special projects at Cure, and she's been organizing landowners and communities in Minnesota against proposed carbon capture pipelines. Her work has been instrumental in exposing how these projects threaten water, farmland, public safety, while offering no real benefit to rural communities. She's led advocacy efforts to strengthen state policies and stop carbon capture expansion. David Schlissel been a consultant on energy and environment issues for more than 5 decades. Most recently, he's been the director of resource planning at IEFA, the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. He has written and testified as an expert witness on technical and financial feasibility of the carbon capture industry since 2007. We'll also hear from Jane Patton, U.S. Fossil Economy Campaign Manager at the Center for International Environmental Law. She's fought against petrochemical pollution and carbon capture greenwashing in Louisiana and beyond. She's worked to expose how the carbon capture industry serves as a lifeline to the fossil fuel industry and has helped coordinate national and international resistance to these dangerous projects. This is a critical moment. The industry is wrapping up pressure in Washington, but we have the power to push back. And by working together, we can stop these dangerous pipelines, block wasteful subsidies, and protect our communities from corporate exploitation. With that, let's hear from our first panelist, Pam Richart, co-director of the Eco-Justice Collaborative, who will discuss the significant health and safety risks of carbon capture pipelines and injection wells. Pam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jim. It's good to be here with everybody tonight. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the infrastructure, and I think that'll set up the rest of the panelists fairly well. So if we could go to the first slide, please. First, except for direct air capture, I want to make sure everybody understands carbon capture and storage does not remove CO2 from the atmosphere. It simply captures it before it's released, compresses it into a liquid, and then transports it via pipeline to a predetermined location where it's injected deep underground. Next slide, please. So what do we know about carbon capture? We know a lot. First, it uses more energy, as much as 40% more. A new plant would be constructed to power the equipment, or an existing plant would run longer and at a higher capacity. But additional pollutants would be released from that process, and those would not be captured. Those would include things like nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxides, and particulate matter. And those pollutants can cause a range of health issues, such as asthma and heart attacks. And where are those plants most often located? In urban areas, surrounded by low-income populations, the elderly, and people of color. I think this is a huge environmental justice concern. Next slide, please. We also know carbon capture requires a lot of water, primarily for cooling. It can potentially double our existing water footprint, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that later from another panelist. But here's an example that helps us understand the magnitude of water that would be used. Retrofitting Illinois' Prairie State Coal Plant would use as much water every day as supplied to the 120,000 residents of Ann Arbor, Michigan. I think that puts it into perspective, at least it does for me. But who is looking at those cumulative impacts? Who is looking at the water scarcity in times of drought? In Illinois, I can say nobody is, at least not yet. And then there's solvents that are used for capturing the carbon that can degrade over time, forming harmful byproducts. If they are left untreated when discharged, they can harm aquatic life and cause cancer in humans. Next slide, please. What do we know about CO2 pipelines? Again, I think a lot. And I think Jim set this up well in his opening remarks. They can leak, they can rupture, and when they do, CO2 is released that can harm or kill people and animals. What I think I want to say here is that when the gas is warmed, it can travel more than a mile, causing the as it did in Satarsha, causing the evacuation of 200 and sending 45 to the hospital. Cars won't run, people can't escape. First responders aren't staff trained or equipped to rescue. So knowing all this, are pipeline developers routing their pipelines safely? My experience says in Illinois, they are not. 3 Illinois projects would have exposed people to concentration levels of CO2 that are more than double what the CDC considers immediately dangerous to life and health. Next slide, please. So after Satarsha, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration announced it would improve safety and oversight via rulemaking. And nearly 3 years later, they issued a pretty good rule. But it wasn't published before the new administration took office, and it's been withdrawn. No one really knows what will happen next or when. In the meantime, there are potentially 96,000 new miles of pipelines, CO2 pipelines that could be built to serve what is considered to be a climate solution, and they could be built without the safety measures that we need. Developers in this process will be granted eminent domain, which never meant to take away landowners' safety for private gain. Next slide, please. We have, next slide, please. There you go. We have little experience with carbon storage. All 13 U.S. projects have underperformed, and most are capturing carbon to get oil out of the ground, which when burned releases more CO2 in the atmosphere. Even if it worked, even if it was fully deployed, CCS would remove just 2.4% of the emissions needed to meet 2030 climate goals set by the ICC. But it's scaling up, and no one can promise permanent storage. It takes 1,000 years or more for CO2 in a saline aquifer, which is what we have here in Illinois, to become inert. And many paths exist for the buoyant, pressurized CO2 to move above the caprock. It can escape along injection wells or monitoring wells. It can escape through faults in caprock that are either unmapped or created by earthquakes. Or it can be released along abandoned wells if CO2 moves above the caprock and make its way to the surface. Leaked CO2 can release toxic heavy metals that contaminate drinking water. That can cause cancer, liver damage, and anemia. And surface leaks can reduce crop yields. Like pipelines, storage requires easements from landowners. And my last slide, please. So, can it work? Well, maybe we'll talk more about this in the Q&A. But Illinois is home to a government-funded project that has been touted as industry's success story across the country. But within 7 years, ADM's second project, its second storage facility, experienced 2 monitoring well leaks. These leaks were the result of design flaws, material failures, operator failures, and lack of EPA oversight. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that CCS, in my view, is still an evolving technology that may have the potential to sequester in the future, but now at its worst, has the potential to harm our communities. Using 45Q to fund this risky technology is an inappropriate use of our taxpayer dollars, and it should be stopped. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pam, for putting these dangers into perspective. I appreciate how you gave a really concise and powerful example of the risks this industry poses to communities, our health, and drinking water, really from start to finish. Now we'll hear from Kim Junker, who will share how the carbon capture industry is impacting her community in Iowa. Kim, turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Jim. Hello, everybody. Can you see me okay?
You're great, Kim.
Okay. Yes, like Jim said earlier, my husband Ted and I are landowners and farmers in the Butler-Grundy County area of Iowa, which is in the north central part of Iowa. We raise corn and soybeans pretty much like the typical Iowa farmer. I was asked to speak tonight about the 45Q federal tax credits and how it affects our farming operation. But before I do, I'll just give you a little background information about me first. I grew up on a farm. My parents and grandparents were farmers. So I guess you could pretty much say that farming runs in my veins. I also like to point out that my husband and I are very conservation-minded farmers. I know there are some farmers out there that only care about profits and farming the heck out of every square inch of land, but we're not like that. Those farmers give the rest of us a bad rap, and of course we have to make profits, and or we wouldn't be in business. But we are also good stewards of the land. So in 2002, we were awarded the Conservationist of the Year award by the Natural Resources Conservation Service for all of our conservation efforts. And some of those conservation efforts included planting over 10,000 trees and shrubs, field windbreaks, shelter belts, grassed filter strips, grassed waterways, and riparian buffers. And then planting crops using no-till and minimum till. And I'm very proud of all the work that we've done to protect our soil and water. And it's also given us the added benefit of enjoying lots of wildlife that call our place home. I love our farm. I love the land. I feel blessed to live in Iowa, where we have some of the richest, most fertile soils in the world. And maybe that's why I'm so passionate about stopping these CO2 pipelines, because of the damage that they do to the land and the water, while only benefiting a few of the that reap the massive taxpayer-funded subsidies. And for those of you who are new to this idea of carbon pipelines and carbon capture and sequestration, or CCS, don't feel like the Lone Ranger. I can remember the first time I heard about this about 4 years ago, and it sounded like something out of a science fiction movie. Since then, I've come to learn more than I ever wanted to know about CCS. The first informational meeting I attended, the room was packed with landowners and farmers, and I remember looking around at their faces and thinking, boy, everybody just looks so bewildered. It's taken me a long time to understand what this whole premise of behind the building of these carbon pipelines was all about. And so I'll try and explain as simply as I know how. Basically, the Summit pipeline would connect to most of the ethanol plants in Iowa and some plants in other states. And I don't recall the exact number right now. It's somewhere around 30, a little over. And it would collect those emissions from the ethanol plants, compress it into a hazardous liquefied state, pump it at extreme pressure across several states, and ending in North Dakota for long-term underground storage. The federal government would pay so much a ton for those emissions to be sequestered. So here's the real kicker. Summit claims that the pipeline will make our ethanol much more valuable and in high demand. But the ethanol hasn't changed a bit. It's still the same ethanol as it was before the pipeline. They also claim that farmers will get more money for our corn if they build this pipeline. And there's absolutely no guarantee that farmers will get a red cent more for our corn. The other kickers is how Summit would tear up our farms to build these pipelines. And Bruce Rastetter, the owner of Summit, is destroying the rainforest in Brazil to build ethanol plants, then ship that ethanol here to the United States to compete with our ethanol, because supposedly our ethanol doesn't have a low carbon score. Summit's Bruce Rastetter would control a big share of the ethanol industry and have a leg up on the ethanol used for sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. I don't think that non-farming people really understand how a pipeline affects the soil structure. When you dig a trench for a pipeline, the fertile topsoil is inevitably mixed in with the less productive clay subsoil. And quite often that mixing of soils can diminish productivity for years or even decades. We've seen this before with the Dakota Access Pipeline that was built around 10 years ago through Iowa. And we've seen it with other pipelines too. Most of Iowa's farmland uses drainage tile to make the land more productive. And a lot of the farms are pattern tiled, which means that an entire parcel of land is drained with rows of parallel tile that can be spaced anywhere from 30 to 50 feet apart. This can be a pretty hefty investment in a farm. And when a pipeline is laid across that land, it has the potential to cut through all those tile lines. Once that happens, it's extremely difficult to repair those and get them back to the original so they'll drain properly. Now, Summit says that everything will be just fine, and they assure everyone that the pipeline will be safe and you can just farm over it like before. However, the heavy construction equipment that's used to build these pipelines causes compaction that impairs root growth and water infiltration into the soil, which can significantly reduce crop yields for a very long time. And I think maybe Pam alluded to this, but the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, just came out recently with safety regulations that put a 2-mile buffer a 2-mile buffer zone on each side of the pipeline. I think that's telling. I call that the kill zone. And if there's a rupture that would occur, there's no way you could outrun that. CO2 is an asphyxiant that displaces oxygen. And that's not very reassuring when you're harvesting crops over the top of a ticking time bomb. When Summit first came out trying to get landowners to sign these easements, they assured everyone how this pipeline was just like the fizz in your soda pop. But we learned after the CO2 pipeline rupture in Satarsha, Mississippi, just how dangerous it actually is. Try telling the 45 people who went to the hospital and still have lingering health problems. I think they would disagree. It's not like your soda pop. So anyways, in closing, I just want to say that we don't need a bunch of unnecessary CO2 pipelines crisscrossing our state, utilizing eminent domain, tearing up our farms, destroying their productivity and drainage tile, monopolizing the CO2 and ethanol plants, draining our aquifers and power grids, all for a hypothetical, speculative economic development project that will cost the taxpayers billions of dollars only to enrich a few. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Kim, for joining us here tonight. It's really powerful to hear firsthand how this industry is impacting you directly and really creating a lot of fear in your community, and just understanding how America's farmers are being impacted by this and what you're really facing because of this reckless industry. So thank you so much for being here to share tonight. Next, we'll hear from Peg Furshong, from CURE, who will talk about water impacts of the carbon capture industry. Peg, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jim. If you'll give me just a second, I'll get set up here. I'm kind of multitasking, and just give me a second here. Really, it's very exciting to see everyone here tonight. There's a lot of interest in the presentation, so I'm really glad that you could join us. Some of you might be wondering why we're talking about water when we're talking about CCS or 45Q. It's because really water is essential to this process, and it's not getting a lot of attention or thoughtful analysis in the proposal of these projects and the evaluation of these projects. So we wanted to lift that up a little bit tonight. And so when we look at briefly, because there's not a lot of time tonight, but the 4 areas I just want to touch on, I want to talk a little bit about water consumption and transparency. I want to talk about the stresses and competing water demands. I want to talk about the cost of water, and I want to talk about oversight of water or the lack of oversight. So when we go to water consumption, the thing I really want to emphasize with you tonight is that there's multiple places where water is consumed, and it's not always accounted for in these projects when they're proposed. And so we really just want to put that on your radar. Obviously, you would see water in the construction phase of the infrastructure. That's usually generally used to flush out the lines, to make sure that everything's connected properly, the welds are working and all of that. And then there's a certain amount of water that is used in the operation of these projects. And so for us in the Midwest and in Minnesota, it's around ethanol plants, and that's going to kind of be how I explain this tonight. In the operation of ethanol, there's multiple different touch points that water's involved. So one is in obviously growing corn, or the raw materials that it takes to have to make ethanol. When we're growing that corn, sometimes it's irrigated, sometimes it's not. Very water intensive crop. And then when we go to make ethanol, the industry tells us it takes about 3 to 3.5 gallons of water to make 1 gallon of ethanol. And then when we add this carbon capture process to the mix, they're telling us it's just short of doubling the water footprint. So it's taking roughly about 6.5 gallons of water to, capture the carbon off an ethanol plant and produce ethanol. And when we're capturing the carbon, primarily that water is going to cool the infrastructure, because whenever we have projects that require huge amounts of energy, which capturing the carbon does, there's often water expended in the infrastructure process. And so that's another area that you can look at on the plant itself. So cooling the equipment, the carbon capture equipment on the plant. But in order to capture the carbon at an ethanol plant, that's very water intensive and energy intensive as well. They have to take the gas that's produced, the CO2 that's produced, and as Pam referred earlier, they have to heat it to really high temperatures to distill it and make sure that all of the water and moisture is out of that gas. And as they do that, it turns it into a liquid phase. It's a dense liquid phase that then they can put in the pipeline and transport in the pipeline. And one of the things that's important to remember is whenever we have CO2 and water and that mixes, that creates carbonic acid, and that's highly corrosive. And that has been part of the industry's challenge for the last 2 decades in infrastructure failures, is how corrosive this material is. So another area of water consumption that's often not accounted in these processes are when we have to increase the energy footprint or the demand of energy to add carbon capture on. It's oftentimes not even part of the permitting process, because the ethanol plant or the company that's doing the carbon capture is purchasing the power off-site. And so it's not considered part of the water footprint typically, but you need to know that it does have a huge impact on the consumption. And so it really is important to think about the cradle to grave analysis and really making sure that you have the entire picture when you're doing that. Stresses and demands for water. We know across the country that we have been having drought, and we have had water shortages, groundwater issues in general. So the Southwest, the West Coast, the Rocky Mountain region, many areas, even up in upper Midwest for the last couple of years, Minnesota, Iowa, the Dakotas, have had drought, and that has stressed our groundwater, and we've struggled to actually meet the drinking water demands without carbon capture already being added on to all these ethanol plants in our footprint. And so when you think about it, it's industrial agriculture, ethanol or biofuels industry, carbon capture, the emerging technologies and energy that are coming on the horizon with data centers and hydrogen hubs. Everyone's going to be competing for water because water is essential to all these processes. The other things that you might want to be thinking about when related to drinking water and groundwater supplies outside of the industrial load and the drinking water load is when we have issues of contamination, when there's a rupture and that CO2 gets into the water, that also can be problematic. And then also sometimes these industries and processes have discharge that contaminates. And then of course, we have climate, and climate's something that we have no control over and seems to be escalating and making it much more challenging to figure out the modeling for these projects. Then we have the cost of water. things that you need to be looking at with these projects is oftentimes ethanol plants, industrial agriculture, and or carbon capture, as well as some of these other emerging technologies, end up getting an industrial bulk rate for their water. So they're not even paying what rates consumers or residential users are paying. And should they be? You know, this industry is touting the millions of dollars they're going to make off of this project once it's fully operational. And should we be subsidizing with industrial bulk rates for water, or should they be paying the full value of water? Kind of leans back to what Pam was talking about with some of the environmental justice issues around water. And then there's always, like, when we are in drought, who decides who gets the water? If there's not enough water, we had a water manager testify at one of our hearings before the pipeline's even been built, when we were having drought issues in south central Minnesota, that he didn't even have enough water for the communities that he needed to service in his territory. And there were ethanol plants in the territory. So if they added carbon capture onto the demand load, he wasn't sure how he was going to prioritize it, because in essence, we don't have a way to there are policies in place in some cases, but we don't have a Department of Energy at the federal level. We have a Department, we have a Department of Energy at the federal level. We don't have a Department of Water. Water is subject to so many different policies and statutes, and it goes by state and or region. There's not consistency across the country about how we deal with water, and that can be a challenge. So the 4 takeaways that I really just want you to think about today is the lack of transparency with the complete footprint cradle to grave. Many of these energy and water intensive projects are being cited without evaluating water supplies first. So look at the permitting process and ask lawmakers and oversight agencies to be sure to include that. Third is, should these industries that stand to make millions with various emerging technologies be getting tax breaks or discount rates for their water? And then I really just want you to think about how critical water is, not only for us as consumers, but also for all these projects. And should water be an afterthought in the race to make money at the detriment of protecting our groundwater resources for the next generation? And I think that's it, Jim.
Thank you so much, Peg, for these important remarks. Water is something that we often forget is so important to everything we do, so important for life. And it's really clear from everything I've seen that these companies who are pushing these pipelines and these injection wells understand the value of water. And if we don't push back on them, we could lose it all. And so thank you so much for highlighting those concerns. I greatly appreciate you doing that. Next, we're going to hear from David Schlissel, an energy economist and financial analyst who will talk about massive carbon capture subsidies and fraud in the carbon capture industry. David, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks for being here tonight.
Good evening, everybody. Under Section 45Q of the federal tax law, an owner of a carbon capture facility receives a tax credit for every metric ton of CO2 that they capture. Right now, they're called 45Q credit. The rules for that give $85 for every metric ton of CO2 that's stored underground, and $60 per metric ton of CO2 that's captured and used for enhanced oil recovery. The company can receive credits for up to 12 years for a project. When you add up all of the credits that would go to carbon capture projects that are proposed for the U.S., the current 45Q rules could cost taxpayers, over $800 billion just by 2050. If the rules are changed as the industry is pushing to raise the credit value from $85 per metric ton to $100 per metric ton, and to extend the period for which credits can be received by a project from 12 to 30 years, the total at 45Q could cost taxpayers could jump to almost $3 trillion. And even that is not as high as it could go in order to meet the federal government's goals of capturing CO2.
David, I'm going to apologize. I'm going to jump in and interrupt you real quick. Representative Rokana just joined us, and I'm told by his staff that he has a very busy schedule that he's hopping in here for. And so we'll come back to you in a minute. And I want to thank you so much, Representative Kana, for being here tonight and to share your concerns with this industry and leadership. And we're really honored to have one of the strongest voices standing up for communities against this dangerous industry in Congress here. So thank you so much for your help and support. And I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt a real expert, and I'm sure that he will have far more substantive things to say, and I appreciate everyone's work, and I so appreciate the advocacy of the organization and all that you've done. Look, I think it's pretty simple, our frame, and that is either you're going to give tax credits to build the new forms of energy that we know are the cheapest. Solar at about 3 cents a kilowatt hour, much cheaper than coal, oil, or even at this point, nuclear. Or you're going to give tax subsidies to build the old type of energy sources that we know are inefficient and that the world is moving away from. And in that frame, when we say that what Trump wants, he claims it's an all of the above strategy, but it really isn't. Because the question is, we know that obviously we have all of the above energy right now. Everyone knows that. The question is, which direction are you going? And the Democrats have said that we are going in the form of having more jobs in solar, in wind, in geothermal, with batteries, with electric vehicles, and we're going to tip the scales in favor of new energy that's going to be the market of the future, and that's the cheapest energy source that there is, and is going to help actually bring down utility costs, bring down bring down the emissions for climate. And their side is saying we're going to take those away. We don't want these jobs. We don't want these jobs in Georgia and in Tennessee and in North Carolina. And what we're really going to do is subsidize the old stuff to drill, because we don't want the cheaper energy source. We want more of the old energy source. And I just think as a common sense voter, even if they don't share our urgency on climate change and aren't seeing the devastating impact of the wildfires in my state and don't get the urgency of the speed of transition, will say that we rather have more of the new stuff than the old stuff, and it's absurd policy to be subsidizing the old stuff that is more expensive. And all of you, I think, can help make that case. It's why I've led on ending fossil fuel subsidies and why we have a real fighting chance to save some of the IRA programs. And then we, of course, expand on what is really necessary in this country. But we're going to need all of your voices, all of your activism. You're at the front lines. Food and Water Watch has always been on the front lines. And I'm just grateful, truly grateful. And we've got the fight of our lives in the next couple of years to make sure we don't go too far backwards.
Well, thank you so much, Representative Khanna. We so appreciate your leadership and your remarks. And I really want to highlight the fact that it is all of us together that are going to really change the direction we're going in and help to make sure that we are moving forward policies that will protect our water, protect our air, protect our communities. And so thank you again for your leadership and for taking time to join us tonight and for all the work you're doing in Congress. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on. Thank you for giving me the chance. And thank you to everyone for your doing the hard work and your advocacy. I can't thank you enough, and know your voice really does matter. It matters certainly in the prioritization of these things within the Democratic caucus, which is important.
Thank you, and have a wonderful evening. Good night,
Thank
sir.
you.
And David, we will turn it back over to you now. Thank you so
Sure.
much for your flexibility.
No problem. I just have a couple of comments to finish with. First, I should mention that these comments are my own since I'm no longer with IEFA, although we agree on everything related to CCS. First is that the process for the payment of 45Q credits will not be transparent. It'll be extremely opaque. We expect that companies will not have to provide detailed information to the IRS before they receive credits, and it's likely that little, if any, information will be given to the public. Thus, there will be widespread opportunities for fraud without periodic oversight and auditing, of the IRS and its review of the 45Q tax credit process. A copy of the fact sheet that discusses Annika's analysis is available at the IEFA website, ieefa.org. Just Google carbon capture fact sheet and you should be able to find it. Good night. That's it, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. And we will send out an update for folks as well. Folks can also see there's a link in the web in the chat. We'll put a link to the in the chat and send that out as an update to everyone as well. And David, thank you so much for being here tonight and sharing your expertise and knowledge about this. And I think one of the things that's really, I think, shocking to everyone is the full size of the subsidy. We're literally talking what could be trillions of dollars, handed over to the industry at a time when we're, have a lot of concern about, runaway budget deficits. This is clearly something that will continue to drive those issues forward and not be invested into our communities and improving the lives of people across the country. So thank you so much for being here. Now we're going to hear from Jane Patton from the Center for International Environmental Law, who will help us dissect the carbon capture industry disinformation machine. Jane, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jim. And I am so honored to be here joining this conversation tonight from my home in South Louisiana, as Jim mentioned, another target for the deployment of this dangerous distraction of carbon capture and storage. I'm a fifth generation Louisianian who ended up refocusing my work onto petrochemicals and carbon capture because of the immense threat faced by my communities and others like it across the country. Every person and policymaker I talk to locally is critical of CCS for all of the reasons you've heard already from other speakers. So if the criticisms are clear and we're all so against it, why do we keep having to talk about carbon capture and storage? And that's because there is a large and powerful network of industry personnel, paid lobbyists, academics, nonprofits, elected officials across both parties that are actively pushing CCS. Some of those nonprofits and academics are industry funded or affiliated and are providing cover for a toxic industry rightly under criticism for its catastrophically harmful pollution. But some of them are truly climate-aware people and institutions grasping for solutions in the midst of a harrowing existential crisis. But as you've heard here tonight, and as the science bears out, carbon capture is just not that solution. There is an active propaganda machine at work in podcasts, radio ads, in public seminars, and flashy Super Bowl ads, and billboards and op-eds to convince you that CCS is both necessary and effective at addressing climate change. But what CCS is actually effective at is prolonging our reliance on fossil fuels, not on reducing emissions. It's easy to be cowed by arguments in support of CCS and to not realize that they are coming from the oil and gas industry. But even shallow digging into any of their justifications proves them to be only smoke and mirrors. For instance, we hear CCS supporters parrot industry talking points that carbon capture should only be used for the hardest to abate emissions and sectors. But what sectors are those? Steel? There are already alternative technologies that produce steel without emitting CO2 by altering the inputs in the energy used to generate heat for steel production. Also, the application of CCS on steel production is almost entirely theoretical, a story more of splashy headlines than of actual data. So what about cement? Remember, cement is currently pretty cheap. That's part of what drives the market for it. If you were actually to add carbon capture to the cement production process, it would increase the price of cement by as much as a factor of 4. The market can't sustain that. Production of cement is really decentralized. It's produced in tiny cement plants deployed as needed near construction sites. We've all seen them around, for instance, road construction, because the material can't be transported very far before use. So is the plan for CCS on cement to pop up movable carbon filters all over the place, which would then have to connect to pipelines? But those aren't temporary and can't just be popped up. Obviously, that's both wildly impractical and extremely expensive. And indeed, there is currently no deployment of CCS on cement production in a real-world application. So if it's not actually being used, and in fact isn't viable in these off-sited sectors, where is carbon capture and storage being used? Well, as David and others laid out, it turns out that the vast majority of captured carbon is already being used by the oil and gas industry, not to reduce their greenhouse gas footprint, but to get even more oil out of depleted wells through what's dubbed enhanced oil recovery. And the new massive build out of carbon management pipelines and wells is also being used by the oil and gas industry to turn fossil fuels like methane into clean burning or low energy fuels like ammonia and hydrogen. But neither of those are a hard to abate industry. It's just more conventional fossil fuels, sometimes being laundered into a net zero label. But CCS is not actually getting emissions nearer to zero. The most up-to-date research we now have shows that the process of pulling methane out of the ground, steam reforming it into hydrogen and then ammonia with the application of CO2 capture, and then condensing and transporting that CO2 via pipeline to be injected underground actually releases more greenhouse gases than just burning the methane. CCS does not work to reduce climate harming emissions, and we are being fooled about where it even can be used, much less where it is being used. And I want to close with a comment on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The industry and policymakers love to assert the talking point that the IPCC says that CCS is absolutely necessary to stay below 1.5 degree temperature rise. But that's not what the IPCC says. The IPCC does say immediate and rapid phase out of all fossil fuels is the cornerstone of any and all mitigation strategies, period. The most effective pathways for avoiding catastrophic climate change as laid out by the IPCC, in fact, focus on measures that would reduce energy demand, replace fossil fuels with renewables, and massively increase electrification. The IPCC reports explicitly state that CCS deployment will increase the shares of fossil fuels, repeatedly warning that CCS and carbon dioxide removal are unproven at scale, are of uncertain benefit for the climate, and pose significant risks of harm to humans and the environment. We deserve better than being fooled. We deserve a climate-safe future, or indeed any future at all. Deploying CCS at such a level that it would turn my home into unlivable Swiss cheese is not the fix that the industry wants you to believe it is. The reality of CCS is more fossil fuels, greater harm to communities, and worsening climate devastation, all at the public's expense. Carbon capture schemes, whether for storage or for additional oil drilling, are a deadly and dangerous distraction from the real transformative action needed to protect American lives and livelihoods. What our policymakers need to be investing in is building out renewable energy across the grid, massive job-creating electrification and energy efficiency programs, and support for people already harmed or threatened by climate change, not perpetuating the very industries that got us into this crisis to begin with. Thank you for having me here, Jim, and for leading this conversation.
Jane, thank you so much for being here and all the leadership that you bring to the carbon capture movement, or the movement to stop this industry from harming our communities and exposing these dastardly lies. And that's why we're here, right? We're here to build the CCS Action Network, to coordinate and mobilize communities to oppose these dirty energy subsidies and make sure people understand the true nature of this harmful industry. And for those of you who haven't been getting our updates, you can actually sign up to get them, where we'll continue to provide updates on and information about what's happening nationally and in states around carbon capture. There's a link in chat that you can click on to sign up for those updates if you're not getting those updates from the Carbon Capture Action Network. And you don't need to wait until you get the next update from our network to tell your member of Congress that you oppose subsidies for the carbon capture industry. We set up a call-in number that can connect you directly with the congressional switchboard. And by calling 866-582-4813, you can actually call your member of Congress and speak to their staff and leave a message for them. Now, write down that number that we put into chat, and you can call them tomorrow. Raise concerns about the dangerous CO2 pipelines, leaky injection wells that will have an impact on safety. Tell your member of Congress about your concerns with what could be $1 trillion subsidy and tremendous government waste.